The moment they laughed at me was the moment my life stopped belonging to me. I remember the sound first, not the faces, not the words, just the laughter, sharp and echoing under the crystal chandeliers like something breaking that couldn't be fixed. My fingers tightened around the edge of my dress, a simple white gown that suddenly felt too plain, too small, too wrong for a room filled with people who measured worth in diamonds and last names. I shouldn't have been surprised. The signs had been there from the moment I stepped into that ballroom, the way conversations paused just a second too long, the way eyes skimmed over me and dismissed me just as quickly. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself love was supposed to be enough. I told myself a lot of things that night, and every single one of them turned out to be a lie. The ceremony hadn't even started yet, but the damage already had. Someone whispered something behind me, not quietly enough, followed by a ripple of amusement that spread like wildfire. "She's wearing that," another voice said, louder this time, bold enough to be heard. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, my heart beat loud in my ears, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction. Not yet. Not until I absolutely had to. My reflection caught in the polished silver of a serving tray nearby, and for a second, I saw myself the way they did. Not one of them. Not polished. Not powerful. Just, tolerated. I swallowed hard and kept my eyes forward. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. That's what everyone says about weddings, right? But happiness doesn't sound like laughter aimed at you. It doesn't feel like standing in a room full of people and realizing not a single one is on your side. The man I was supposed to marry stood across the room, surrounded by his family, smiling like nothing was wrong. Like I wasn't slowly being erased right in front of him. He didn't look at me. Not once. And somehow, that hurt more than anything they were saying. Because silence, I realized, could be louder than cruelty. The music shifted, soft and elegant, signaling that things were about to begin. Guests started taking their seats, the room settling into a practiced kind of perfection. But underneath it, I could still feel it. The tension. The judgment. The quiet anticipation of something going wrong. My hands trembled as I smoothed down my dress, trying to hold on to whatever dignity I had left. I told myself to breathe. In. Out. Just make it through the next hour. Just say the vows. Just survive this. That was when the laughter came again, louder this time, impossible to ignore. I turned before I could stop myself, and the room didn't even try to hide it anymore. Smiles that weren't kind. Eyes that weren't gentle. Words that weren't meant to be forgiven. And in that exact moment, standing under 1,000 lights that suddenly felt too bright, I realized something cold and undeniable. I was completely alone. Or at least, I thought I was. I should have walked away the second I saw the way his mother looked at me, like I was something she had stepped in and could not quite scrape off her shoe, but I stayed, because leaving would have meant admitting they were right about me, and I was not ready to do that, not yet, not in front of all these people who had already decided exactly who I was without ever asking, and when the officiant called for everyone to gather, I moved on instinct more than anything else, my feet carrying me forward even as every part of me screamed to stop, to run, to disappear before the next thing happened, because I could feel it coming, that shift in the air, that tightening in the room, like a storm about to break but with no thunder, only whispers, and then his voice cut through it all, calm, polished, rehearsed, the same voice that once told me I was different, that I was enough, that I was the one person who did not care about money or status, and now it sounded like a stranger reading lines from a script he had memorized too well. He did not take my hand when I stepped beside him, he did not even look at me at first, and that was when the unease turned into something heavier, something harder to ignore, the kind of feeling that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. The officiant smiled, the guests leaned forward, and I waited for something real, something that would prove I had not imagined everything that led me here, but instead I heard it, soft at first, then clearer, his mother whispering just loud enough for the front rows to hear, asking if this was really necessary, asking if there was still time to fix the mistake, and a few people laughed again, quieter this time but sharper, more deliberate, like they knew exactly where to aim. My throat tightened, my hands went cold, and still I stood there. Still I told myself this would pass, that once the ceremony started everything would fall into place. But then he finally looked at me, and there was nothing there, no warmth, no hesitation, just a kind of polite detachment that felt worse than anger, because anger at least meant something. This meant nothing, and when he spoke, it was not to me, it was to them, to the room, to the people whose approval he had chosen over everything else. I think, he said slowly, adjusting his cuff. Like this was just another business decision, we should address something before we continue, and the room went completely still, not because they were surprised, but because they were waiting for the moment they could enjoy, and I felt it then, the ground shifting under me, the realization settling in that I had walked straight into something I did not understand, something I could not control. My name sounded different when he said it, distant, almost formal, like we were strangers. Connected by paperwork instead of promises, and every eye in the room turned toward me, every whisper stopped, every breath held, and in that silence, I understood that whatever was about to happen was not an accident, it was not a misunderstanding, it was a choice, his choice, and I was the only one who had not seen it coming. My name sounded like a verdict when he said it, not a promise, not something chosen with love but something presented as evidence, and I felt every pair of eyes in that room shift toward me at the exact same moment, like I had become the center of something I never agreed to be part of, my pulse loud in my ears, my fingers curling slightly at my sides as I waited for him to continue, because there was nothing else I could do, no way to stop what had already started, and he took a slow breath, the kind that people take when they are about to say something important, something calculated, something they have practiced in their head 100 times before saying it out loud. I think it is only fair, he said, his voice steady, controlled, almost gentle in a way that made it worse, that everyone here understands exactly what this is, and a few people in the front row leaned forward, their expressions sharpening with interest, anticipation, like they had been waiting for this reveal all along, and I felt my stomach drop, because suddenly it was clear that I was the only one who had not been given the script, the only one who did not know how this scene was supposed to end, and he finally looked at me fully, his eyes scanning my face like he was searching for something that was no longer there. Or maybe never had been. Emily, he continued, softer now. But not kinder, you are a good person, and the word good landed wrong, like something polite people say when they do not have anything real to offer, and a quiet murmur moved through the guests, subtle but unmistakable, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, every second stretching longer than it should, every breath harder to take. But this, he gestured lightly between us, like what we had built could be reduced to a simple motion of his hand, this was never going to work. And there it was, clean, precise, final, the kind of statement that leaves no room for argument, no space for misunderstanding, just an ending delivered in front of witnesses, and for a second I thought I might collapse, not from weakness but from the sheer force of it, the realization hitting all at once that this had been decided long before I walked down that aisle, long before I believed any of it was real. And the laughter came again, quieter this time but sharper, more confident now that the performance had reached its turning point, and I saw his mother smile, not wide, not openly, but enough to tell me everything I needed to know, and something inside me shifted, not breaking this time, but hardening, because if this was what they wanted, if this was how they chose to end it, then I was not going to give them the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. I lifted my chin slightly, forcing my shoulders back, forcing myself to stand there even as my heart pounded against my ribs, even as my throat burned with everything I refused to say, and for the first time since I arrived, the room did not feel overwhelming. It felt clear, almost quiet, like I had stepped outside of it even though I was still standing right in the center. And that was when I noticed something different, not in the people I already knew, not in the faces that had judged me from the moment I walked in, but somewhere deeper in the room, past the rows of polished guests and carefully arranged tables, a presence that did not belong to the noise or the laughter or the performance, something still, something controlled, something watching, and I could not explain why, but the moment I felt it, the moment I became aware of it, the air changed, just slightly, just enough to make me realize that whatever was happening to me was not the only thing unfolding in that room. It was subtle at first, the kind of shift you would miss if you were not already standing on the edge of something breaking, but I felt it, a quiet change in the room that did not belong to the laughter or the whispers or the carefully constructed humiliation unfolding in front of me. It was something else entirely, something heavier, steadier, like a weight pressing down that no one had acknowledged yet. And I found myself looking past the faces I already knew, past the people who had made their opinions clear, searching without meaning to, until my eyes landed on him, and everything else blurred for just a second, not because he moved, but because he did not. He sat at the far end of the room, slightly removed from the center, surrounded but not crowded, as if space itself understood not to get too close, an older man, maybe mid-60s. Dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it did not need to demand attention to command it, his posture relaxed but deliberate, one hand resting lightly on the table in front of him, the other holding a glass he had not touched in several minutes, and his eyes were on me, not curious, not amused, just watching, like he had been watching long before this moment began, and for reasons I could not explain, my breath caught, because there was something in that gaze that did not match the room. Something that did not align with the cruelty or the performance or the shallow satisfaction rippling through the guests. It was too calm, too certain, too aware, and I realized with a quiet shock that while everyone else had been reacting, he had been observing, and that difference mattered more than I understood. I looked away quickly, instinctively, because holding that gaze felt like stepping into something deeper than I was ready for, but the awareness did not leave me. It stayed, settled somewhere just beneath my ribs, and behind me, the conversation continued as if nothing had changed, as if I had not just been dismissed in front of an entire room, as if the ceremony had not been quietly dismantled piece by piece. The officiant cleared his throat, uncertain now, unsure whether to continue or step aside. My almost husband shifted slightly, adjusting his jacket again, already moving on, already preparing to recover the narrative in a way that would leave him untouched, and I felt it then. The final piece falling into place. This was not about me anymore, not to them. I was a detail, a footnote, something to be corrected and forgotten, and that realization should have crushed me. It should have left me standing there with nothing, but instead it did something else, something unexpected. It made everything quieter, clearer, like the noise had been turned down just enough for me to hear my own thoughts again, and in that quiet, I made a decision, not a loud one, not dramatic, just a small, steady shift inside me. I would not beg, would not explain. I would not give them anything more than they had already taken. I turned slightly, ready to step away, ready to leave whatever this had been behind me without another word, because dignity, I realized, did not require permission, it only required choice, and I chose it, even if I had to walk out alone, even if every eye in the room followed me, even if the laughter came back louder once I turned my back. I would still leave, I would still walk, because staying would mean agreeing with them, and I refused to do that. I took a breath, steadying myself, shifting my weight forward, preparing to take that first step, and that was when I heard it, the soft but unmistakable sound of a chair moving across polished floor, not rushed, not loud, but enough to cut through everything else. Enough to make the room hesitate, just for a second, just long enough for me to pause without meaning to. And something deep in my chest told me, with absolute certainty, that whoever had just stood up was not someone this room could ignore. The sound was not loud, but it carried, the kind of quiet authority that did not need volume to command attention, and the moment it happened, the room shifted in a way I had never felt before. Conversation stalled mid-sentence, laughter cut short like it had been swallowed, even the music seemed to hesitate, as if it understood something had just changed, and I did not need to turn to know it was him. I felt it. That same presence I had noticed moments ago now moving, deliberate, unhurried. Each step measured like time itself was adjusting to him instead of the other way around, and when I finally looked, he was already halfway across the room, not forcing space but taking it, guests instinctively stepping aside before he reached them, their expressions tightening, shifting from casual amusement to something else, something closer to caution, because they knew him, or at least they knew what he represented. Even if no one said his name out loud, and that silence said more than any introduction ever could. He did not rush, did not acknowledge the tension he created, his gaze fixed forward until it landed on me again, steady, unwavering, like I was the only point in the room that mattered, and for a second, I forgot everything else, forgot the humiliation, the whispers, the man standing beside me who had just erased me with a few carefully chosen words, because this was different. This was not performance, it was something real. Something controlled, something that did not need approval from anyone in that room. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the details now, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver threaded through his dark hair, the kind of presence that came from years of being listened to without question, and still, he said nothing, not right away, just stood there, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable for everyone else, until the room itself seemed to lean in, waiting, and I could feel the shift happening again, deeper this time, heavier, like the balance of something invisible had just tipped. My almost husband cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim control, to restore the order he had just rewritten in his favor. "Sir," he started, polite but strained, "I am not sure this concerns," but he did not finish, because the older man did not look at him, did not acknowledge him at all, and somehow that was worse, because it made his words irrelevant before they were even spoken, and when he finally moved, it was simple, a slight reach toward the microphone resting on the stand near the officiant, a small, almost casual gesture that somehow carried more weight than anything that had happened so far. The officiant hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped back without being asked, without needing to be told, because everyone in that room understood instinctively that this was no longer their moment to control. The microphone shifted into his hand, and for a brief second, I could hear my own breathing again, sharp, uneven, the only sound that felt real, and then he spoke, his voice low but clear, not raised, not forced, just enough to carry across the room and settle into every corner like it belonged there. "That is enough," he said, not loudly, but with a finality that made it feel like the room itself had been instructed to obey. And everything stopped, truly stopped this time, no whispers, no laughter, no movement, just silence, complete and absolute, and then he turned slightly, just enough that his gaze met mine again, and for the first time that night, I did not feel small, I did not feel dismissed, I felt seen. Fully, completely, in a way that made my chest tighten for an entirely different reason, and when he spoke again, it was not to the room, not to the people who had judged me, but to me, even though everyone heard it. "You do not stand here alone," he said quietly, and something in those words settled deep inside me, something steady, something unshakable, something that made me realize this moment was no longer about what I had lost, but about something I had never expected to find. The words settled over the room like something permanent, like a line had been drawn that no one was willing to cross, and I could feel it in the way people shifted, in the way their confidence dissolved into something uncertain, something cautious, because whatever authority they thought they had just moments ago had been quietly taken from them without a single raised voice, and I stood there, caught between disbelief and something else I could not quite name, because no one had ever stepped in for me like this before, not in a room like this, not against people like them, and for a second I did not know what to do with it, did not know how to respond to a kind of protection I had never been offered, and beside me, the man who had just ended everything let out a small, controlled breath, the kind that comes from someone trying to regain composure after losing control in a way they did not expect. "Sir," he tried again, his tone sharper now, more defensive, "this is a private matter." But the older man did not even glance in his direction, did not acknowledge him as part of the conversation, and that dismissal carried more weight than any direct confrontation could have, because it made him irrelevant, and I saw it happen, the flicker of something in his expression, not anger exactly, but the realization that he was no longer the one guiding this moment, that whatever narrative he had prepared had just been interrupted in a way he could not easily fix, and the silence stretched again, thicker now, heavier, pressing against every person in the room until it became impossible to ignore, and then the older man lifted the microphone slightly, not dramatically, just enough to draw the focus back to him, back to what he was about to say, and when he spoke again, his voice did not change, it did not rise or sharpen, it remained calm, controlled, precise, the kind of voice that did not need to prove anything because it already knew it would be heard. "There is nothing private about humiliation done in public," he said, each word deliberate, measured, impossible to misinterpret, and a ripple moved through the guests. Not laughter this time, not amusement, something quieter. Something closer to discomfort, because he had named it, he had stripped away the pretense and left only the truth of what had just happened, and suddenly it did not look elegant anymore, it did not look like a carefully handled situation, it looked exactly like what it was, and people noticed. I saw it in their faces, in the way they avoided looking directly at me now, in the way their attention shifted, uncertain where to land, because the dynamic had changed and they did not know how to adjust to it, and I felt it too, that shift, not just in the room but inside myself, something steadying, something grounding, like I was no longer standing on unstable ground, like I had something solid beneath me again even if I did not fully understand where it came from. And then he turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the space beside me, not the man who had rejected me, but me, only me, and the intensity of that focus made my breath catch, not out of fear this time, but something deeper, something unfamiliar, because there was no judgment there, no hesitation, just certainty, and when he spoke again, the words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled into every corner of the room, into every quiet space left by the absence of laughter. If she stands here, he said slowly, then she stands with me, and it was not a question, not a suggestion, it was a statement, clear and undeniable. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. The room had stopped deciding who I was the second he chose to speak, and whatever happened next would no longer be dictated by the people who had tried to break me, but by something far more powerful, something that had just stepped into my life without warning, without permission, and somehow, without asking, had already begun to change it. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and absolute, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, like the entire room was waiting for someone to challenge him and realizing at the same time that no one would, and I felt it again, that shift, deeper now, irreversible, because something had changed not just in the air but in the way people looked at me. The same faces that had dismissed me minutes ago now carried hesitation, calculation, as if they were reassessing everything they thought they knew, and it was unsettling, not because I wanted their approval, but because I could see how quickly it could be taken back, how fragile their confidence really was when something stronger entered the room, and beside me, the man who had once promised me forever finally lost whatever composure he had left. "This is inappropriate," he said, louder this time, his voice cutting through the silence but lacking the control it had before. "You do not get to interfere like this," and for the first time, the older man turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge that the words had been spoken, and the look he gave him was not angry, not even irritated, it was measured, almost indifferent, like he was deciding whether the interruption was worth his attention, and that alone was enough to make the tension spike again, because indifference, I realized, could be more powerful than confrontation. It reduced everything else to something smaller, something unworthy of effort, and when he responded, his voice did not rise, did not sharpen, it remained calm, steady. "I already have," he said simply, and there was no argument in it, no space for debate, just a fact stated as if the outcome had been decided long before this moment began, and a ripple moved through the guests again, quieter this time, more controlled, like they were adjusting to a reality they had not anticipated. And I stood there, caught between two worlds that no longer felt connected, one that had rejected me without hesitation and another that had stepped in without warning, and I did not fully understand either one, but I knew which one felt real, which one felt solid beneath my feet, and before I could stop myself, before I could second-guess it, I took a small step, not away from him, but closer, just a fraction, just enough to close the distance that had been left between us, and the movement did not go unnoticed. I saw it in the way a few people exchanged glances, in the way the atmosphere shifted again, because choices like that did not happen without consequence, especially not here, especially not in front of people who had built their lives around control and expectation. And yet I did not stop, I did not pull back, because something inside me had already decided, something quiet but certain, and I felt it when he looked at me again, not surprised, not questioning, just aware, like he had expected nothing less, and without a word, he reached out, not to take, not to claim, but to steady, his hand resting lightly against my arm for just a second, grounding, reassuring, a gesture so controlled it spoke louder than anything else that had been said. And I realized then that this was not about possession the way they understood it, it was about presence, about standing beside someone when no one else would, and that difference mattered more than I could explain, and behind us, the room remained suspended in that fragile silence, waiting, watching, unsure of what would happen next, because whatever this moment had become, it was no longer predictable, no longer something they could script or control, and for the first time that night, I was not the one being watched with judgment, I was the one standing at the center of something no one else could interrupt, and the realization settled into me slowly, steadily, like something taking root. This was not the end of my humiliation, it was the beginning of something else entirely, something that none of them had seen coming, not even me. The contact was brief, almost nothing, just the weight of his hand against my arm for a single second, but it grounded me in a way I did not expect, like the world had stopped tilting and finally found its center again, and I realized I was no longer shaking, my breathing steadying without me forcing it, my thoughts no longer scattered but sharp, focused, and for the first time since I walked into that room, I was not reacting, I was choosing, and that difference changed everything, because now when I looked at the faces around me, I did not see power, I saw uncertainty, I saw people recalculating, adjusting their expressions, their posture, their distance, because whatever they thought they understood about this situation had just been rewritten, and they did not know the rules anymore, and that made them cautious, and caution, I realized, was the first crack in control, and the silence stretched again, not empty this time, but charged, waiting, as if the room itself was holding its breath for what would come next, and the older man did not rush to fill it, he let it sit, let it settle, let everyone feel the weight of what had already been said, because he did not need to prove anything further, the shift had already happened, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried the same calm certainty, but there was something else beneath it now, something quieter, more personal. There are moments, he said slowly, his gaze still fixed on me, when a person shows you exactly who they are, not with promises, not with words prepared in advance, but with choices made when it matters most, and I felt that, deeply, because I had just lived it. I had just watched someone choose to walk away from me in front of an entire room, and now I was watching someone else choose to step forward, and the contrast between those two choices was impossible to ignore, impossible to misunderstand, and he turned slightly then, just enough to let his words reach the rest of the room without losing their focus. What you witnessed here tonight, he continued, was not a mistake, it was a decision, and a quiet ripple moved through the guests again, not loud, not disruptive, just enough to show that they were listening differently now, that they were hearing something they could not easily dismiss, and I could feel the tension shifting again, not away from me this time, but away from the narrative they had built, because it no longer held, it no longer made sense in the presence of something stronger, something clearer, and beside me, the man who had once stood at the center of this event said nothing, his silence now heavier than before, because it was no longer chosen, it was imposed, and I saw it in the way he looked around, searching for support that was no longer there, searching for control that had slipped beyond his reach, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt something close to sympathy, not for what he had done, but for what he had revealed about himself, because losing control in front of people who value it above everything else is a kind of exposure that cannot be undone, and I turned my attention back to the man beside me, to the one who had changed everything without raising his voice, and there was a question forming in my mind, one I did not yet have the courage to ask, because this did not feel random, it did not feel accidental, it felt intentional in a way I could not yet explain. And as if he sensed it, as if he understood the direction of my thoughts without needing to hear them, he leaned slightly closer, just enough that his next words reached me first before they reached anyone else, low, controlled, meant only for me even though the room could still hear. I told them, he said quietly, his voice carrying that same steady authority, that you were not to be treated this way, and my breath caught, not from fear, but from the weight of what that meant, because it implied something far beyond this moment, something that had started long before I ever stepped into this room, and as I stood there, trying to understand how my life had shifted so completely in a matter of minutes, one truth settled into place with quiet certainty: this was not the beginning of something new, it was the revelation of something that had been unfolding long before I realized it. The words settled into me slower than everything else that night, not because I did not understand them, but because I understood them too well, because they carried a weight that reached beyond this room, beyond this moment, into something I had not seen, something I had not noticed, and I found myself searching his face, looking for answers in the quiet certainty of his expression, in the way he stood there like none of this had surprised him, like he had expected it, prepared for it, and somehow that realization did not frighten me the way it should have, it steadied me, because for the first time that night, something made sense, not everything, not yet, but enough to shift the ground beneath me from confusion to clarity, and I became aware again of the room around us, of the people. Still watching, still waiting, but no longer controlling what happened next, because whatever influence they had held had already dissolved, replaced by something they could not challenge, something they would not risk challenging, and I could see it in the way they avoided direct eye contact now, in the way their posture softened, their voices lowered, as if they were careful not to draw attention back to themselves. And I realized that power did not always announce itself, sometimes it simply existed, undeniable, reshaping everything around it without effort, and I turned my attention back to him, to the man who had stepped into my life at the exact moment I thought it had fallen apart, and there was a question forming on my lips, fragile but persistent, because I needed to understand, needed to know how someone like him could possibly know anything about me, about what I had just gone through, about what I had endured in silence before tonight ever began, but before I could speak. He did, not loudly, not for the room, just enough for me to hear clearly. "You were not supposed to face this alone," he said, and there was something in his tone that stopped me, something that felt less like explanation and more like truth, and I felt it settle into me, that quiet certainty again, that sense that this was not coincidence, that this moment had been building in ways I had not seen, and I took a breath, steady, intentional, and for the first time since everything began, I spoke. My voice softer than I expected but stronger than I felt. "Why?" I asked, the single word carrying more than just curiosity, carrying everything I had not yet said, everything I had not yet understood. And he did not hesitate, did not look away, his gaze steady on mine as if he had been waiting for that question. "Because I pay attention," he answered simply, and somehow that was enough, not a full explanation, not a complete answer, but enough to tell me that this was not about chance, it was about choice, his choice, and something inside me shifted again, not uncertainty this time, but acceptance, not of everything, not yet, but of this moment, of what had just happened, of the fact that my life had changed in a way I could not reverse, and I turned slightly, looking once more at the room that had nearly broken me just minutes ago, and it looked different now, smaller, quieter, less certain, like it had lost something it could not recover, and I realized then that I had lost something too, but not what I thought, not dignity, not worth. Those had never belonged to them to take. I had lost the illusion that I needed their approval to stand where I was, and in its place, I had gained something far more dangerous, far more powerful, the understanding that the right person does not ask you to prove your value, they recognize it before anyone else does, and as I stood there beside him, no longer alone, no longer uncertain, one truth settled into me with quiet finality. The night I thought would destroy me had instead revealed exactly who was willing to stand when it mattered, and once you see that, you cannot ever go back to who you were before.